And then going, I take a chance. I join as a co-founder. If it doesn't work out, I'll figure out something else. But like, how can I not take this chance to work with these two people and see what we can build?
We had 5 minutes where the meeting was running late. He sat down beside me and we were just chatting. He looked at me and went, "So Jason, are you two going to get together? And if so, what's it going to mean for the company?" And we're going into a meeting in like 3 minutes and my jaw is on the floor going, timing?
There's not a lot of certainty with running a startup. So that's kind of what you sign up for. But pairing that with the personal side also being hit with uncertainty, that was not a period I would like to repeat.
Welcome to How I Met My Co-Founder, the podcast where entrepreneurs share raw stories behind how their founding teams met, built trust, and navigated conflict. I'm your host and team relationship expert, Annie Garofalo, and here's your all-access pass into the conversations that can make or break a founding team. Today, we're joined by Professor Jason Blackstock and social entrepreneur Alana Heath, co-founders of How to Change the World, a social enterprise providing students and early career professionals with the skills to build a more sustainable future. Wondering how you can help change the world? If you're an investor, higher education institution, or corporate sustainability partner, grab their contact info in the show notes and reach out. While these two co-founders may have met as business partners, they've since grown into life partners. I'll turn it over to Jason and Alana to tell their co-founder origin story turned love story. Welcome to the show.
Annie, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here. We met in the middle of 2019. I had just been spinning How to Change the World out as a social enterprise from University College London. In the summer of 2019, I went to a cooking class of all places that happened to be at a social impact club here in London. And that's where I met Alana. One of Alana's friends actually came over and said, "Jason, you do climate change. Alana works on climate change. Talk." And we went, "Hi." And we just ended up chatting and talking for a lot of the evening. And then the next morning, I got this email from Alana saying, "I'm thinking of transitioning careers and would love to just get together and chat." And I wasn't entirely sure if this was sort of outreaching to go for coffee for potentially a date or something.
Well, I'd gone to this cooking class with my friend and it was purely a social thing, but I was also very much on the lookout for my next position. And when I met Jason, I was like, this guy is awesome. He's uber smart, super well connected in my industry of like renewable energy, climate change. I was like, I'm going to just jump right in, follow up with him the next day. And so I do tend to get up early. So I sent an email before 7 a.m. And of course, that is one of the things that we have in common is that we are both early risers, dive right in at the start of the day. So he answered right away. And then the only time Jason was available to meet for coffee was on the weekend. And so it put this twist on like meeting on a Sunday isn't quite your professional networking, but I was just professional, 100%. Like that was the only thing on my mind, which that changed pretty quickly. But at that point in time, I showed up and was like, all right, who can you introduce me to? Which sounds ridiculous right now.
But I also remember that she described her sort of background and all of the sort of operational skills and capabilities she has and having set up her own nonprofit before and been an impact investor and developed ventures. I was like, I think Duncan and I could use a little help here. So long story short, we had that coffee meeting on a Sunday because I was heading off to Canada shortly. It led to sort of a bunch of emails back and forth and Alana finally leaving her old job and joining as of the beginning of October. And between October and the end of November, it became blatantly apparent it was more than just sort of advising and consulting. She was laying the foundations, the bedrock for the operations of everything that we had the potential to build. I can't remember if it was Duncan or me that had that first conversation going, we really think she's a co-founder here because she's basically building this thing. And so we wanted to have that conversation relatively quickly. And I think we had the first one shortly before Christmas, even before we all got together. So Alana, Duncan, and myself in Ottawa in January of that year.
Wow. And it sounds like a very fortuitous story. That Alana, you knew you were looking for a professional change, but didn't know exactly how. Jason, you were starting this company with Duncan, but weren't necessarily on the search for a third co-founder. And then you kind of met, realized each other's functional complementarities, joined forces in what sounds to me like a trial period almost, even if that wasn't the intent in the moment. But joining on as a consultant, an advisor, testing out that working relationship before making the call and saying, this feels more like a co-founder to me. Can you share more about, Jason, what you saw in terms of an add to your company and saying, this feels like a co-founder role? And Alana, from your experience, saying, yeah, this is a company I might want to join full time. What went on in those 2 months between October, mid to late November?
Duncan and I are both quantum physicists. It is very easy for Duncan and I to think big, hairy, audacious goals. And in a conversation, we'll have about 12.5 ideas. And I think the thing that became very apparent very quickly was Alana was the one going, stop, hang on, this idea, how does it happen? What's required? What money is required? What people are required? What time frame is required? And we're like, oh, you have to do that in order to turn this into a company, don't you? I'm being a little facetious and exaggeratory here, but the level of detail and the level of organization and structure, that sort of business-oriented brain, and Alana having not only an MBA, but also an MBA focused on social enterprise with real venture experience and impact investing and understanding how to structure things, it became blatantly obvious we could not build and scale anything without that capability set, and Alana was bringing it in spades. And Alana, I don't know what you saw in those early days that made you think, yeah, two crazy quantum physicists, sure, I'm in.
It was the big ideas. I mean, a name like How to Change the World has a lot to live up to. And those numerous ideas, I mean, there were way too many of them. I was like, there's no way we can make like half of these work. But if we only make like a handful work, that's going to be huge. Like, that's going to be so exciting. They're both kind of visionaries in the way of they can see what the moonshot is and see a path there and not get daunted by the details of all of the different reasons that you'll never get to the moon. And I saw my skill set really complementing that because I can also dream big, but I get caught a little bit in, well, how are we going to make it happen? What are those steps? What do we need to have in place to be able to reach the moon? And how do we make sure that we're on that path and we're not kind of circling around in orbit chasing planets? I don't know. I took that metaphor really far. And the other thing that I saw is two quantum physicists, super smart, Ivy League school backgrounds, incredibly impressive careers, and the most humble, respectful, who will just stop to listen. There was no ego involved. And so when I saw that combination, it was really enticing and it was really exciting. And then going, I take a chance. I join as a co-founder. If it doesn't work out, well, I'll figure out something else. But like, how can I not take this chance to work with these two people and see what we can build?
It's so interesting. One thing you were saying is that the initial thing that brought you in was these big ideas and how that was very complementary to your kind of execution focus. And so I was hearing a difference there, right? You were seeing something that you admired because maybe that wasn't your natural tendency. And that was the first kind of thing that brought you in. And then secondly, the low ego atmosphere, which was more of a similarity and a values alignment. There's these two elements of having a balance between having a core values, how you think about leadership, how you think about purpose and passion and impact, and having that at the core be very aligned. But then as it gets to the how, having those as differences and kind of being able to pull each other in different directions and push each other to make sure that these big visions are balanced out with execution and focus. Was there ever a tension there in when those skill sets were kind of coming to play and you did need to focus and prioritize in the early days?
As I'm thinking, my response would be no, because, and I'd love to make sure that we circle back to that values piece, because that is a really, really critical piece. I think I would have been the anchor in that, being like, how are we going to execute this? There's no way to do this. This is impossible. But I feel like I have the capacity, and I've improved a lot over the last few years, of being able to put that aside and say, we're just going to try it out. There's no time to worry or think about what might not work well. Let's just get going. There's a great line: action is the antidote to anxiety. And I think kind of that execution of how are we going to make this happen? Every startup faces those questions of needing to figure it out and do it on the fly and build the tracks in front of you. And so I don't think there was ever, that I can remember, kind of times where that clashed. Jason, are you thinking of a time? I'm like,
not in the early days. I think we've had some times later on as we've grown and developed, but that certainly wasn't in the early days. In the early days, there was a lot of experimentation and figuring things out. I think there was a bit that sort of coincided because it was, 2019, November, December, Alana transitioned from being consultant to co-founder by January. January is actually when we had that let's all get together in Ottawa, and Duncan hosted at his house. And we had some of those really foundational conversations about values. And that's, I think, what Alana was referring to earlier. That was so essential. And I think that values alignment and the amount of time we spent talking about, well, what are the values that make us want to build how to change the world in the first place? And since we're building a company together, what are the values we have personally that we're looking to get out of it? And what do we want out of our lives in the next 5 to 10 years? And that was really essential to laying the foundation, so that when it came to some of these questions about, how many of the crazy, wacky ideas that Jason and Duncan can bounce back and forth about, how many of them are we going to take forward? We always had some North Star metrics to go back to go, well, what gives us the biggest impact? What aligns with us not taking on so much that we're just going to burn out? And not sure we always got that one entirely right, but the values alignment is what has kept us able to run those experiments, but always be able to come back to what's our criteria, what matters, personally and professionally.
So the two criteria that you had mentioned were biggest impact. And then what I was hearing is aligns with passion and kind of drive to make that happen, and to put in the hours that are required of founders to build something up from scratch and take that risk.
Completely agree. I think there was a third value that stood out also very loud and clear for us, that sort of the bridge between the professional and the personal: family. I think that stood out, but also provided some of that balance of where's that line about trying to not burn out, because you need to hold space for the things that are important outside of what you're trying to do within work.
It's very poignant for your relationship as well, as that balance between personal and professional, and keeping capacity and energy for both. So far in the story, we haven't heard about your romantic personal relationship. When did that spark happen? Was that at the offsite in Ottawa?
So there's a funny story attached to this. Some of it goes back right to the beginning. There was certainly some chemistry there. I still wasn't sure whether the first one was a date or not. She was very clear. I had been uncertain. But there had been a lot of like Alana and I were interacting on a daily basis when we were working, and I had been visiting Duncan while traveling through. And Duncan, right before we were going into one meeting, we had 5 minutes where the meeting was running late. He sat down beside me and we were just chatting. He looked at me and went, "So Jason, are you two going to get together? And if so, what's it going to mean for the company?" And we're going into a meeting with potential clients in like 3 minutes, and my jaw is on the floor going, timing? After Duncan raised that, I felt more than a little obligated, because this was in December before Alana was coming, to write to Alana and tell her that Duncan had said this. And if he was observing this, there may be something for us to talk about. But Alana, yes, you got that email. I will leave you to interpret that.
I got this email, very long, super respectful. And I was like, I don't know what to do with this. So I phoned a friend who is my older brother and I was like, what do I do with this? Like, the job is going great. They've invited me like to explore the idea of being a co-founder and to like really be even more involved. And like, what does this mean? And so we picked up several conversations, and this wasn't in person, which made it interesting because Jason was in Canada, I was in the UK. So these were emails and virtual calls to talk about a pretty significant subject. And so what we landed on was we were going to kind of notice, observe, be aware. And then when I joined in Ottawa, we were going to kind of see where those conversations went and if there really was something more there once we were in person and spending time together in person. And so that week in Ottawa was really impactful on the professional side, but also on the personal side, because it was just the three of us. We were starting something mostly from scratch. We had spun out from UCL, but all of the infrastructure that surrounds needed to be built. And we spent most of the week talking about values. It was the cornerstone of all of our conversations, the subjects. It was kind of that pillar that led us through the week. And as we went through that week, and Jason and my values were really aligned. And then when we went into like, where do you, each of us, see ourselves in the next 5 years, in 10 years? There were just these like very similar trajectories with Jason and I. They're just kind of heading in the same direction. Getting into a relationship by spending a week talking about values and where you see yourself in 5 to 10 years. Like that, I think everybody should, because it really set us up to feel that alignment from the beginning. And even then I was dragging my feet. I was like, we're professional colleagues. We're co-founders. We're starting a company. But I went back to my brother and I was like, look, I don't want to close the door on this, but I also I feel like we need to just move slowly and explore what this looks like to be co-founders. And my brother had a great line. He was like, tell Jason this line, not now, maybe later, but later doesn't mean yes. And he was like, that goes for both of you. You like, just take the time, explore, like you're working together, you're spending like 10-hour days together. So you're not short on time. And that lasted for like a week before I was like, yeah, like maybe later. Why later? What am I dragging my heels for? But it gave the time to explore those values, understand each of us as people, not just as colleagues, not the professional facade, and really see the connection that was there without the LinkedIn profile version of who we are, but really bearing that down to what's important to us.
I'm wondering if there's a dating app in there, values first. That like that, or a co-founder app, values first.
100%. And in both of my programs, in the co-founder search program and in the partnership agreement program for teams that are just beginning, the first principle is always self-awareness.
Yep.
And that comes in the form of doing some reflections, developing your values, understanding what you want as a person before you partner up with someone else. And that's true in romantic relationships. It's very much true in workplace relationships, especially when you're building something from scratch. And so to hear you talk about this and hear the intention with which you thought about pursuing not only the working relationship, but also the personal relationship really shows that you thought about what each of you wanted as individuals. Those values you defined back in late 2019, it's now 2023, you dated, got married. How do you think about those values in your day-to-day life, and what are your best practices or processes, both in the workplace, but also in your personal life, to make sure that you are keeping up with those values and how you want to be having that balance?
Great question. For me, the values still resonate as strongly today as they ever have. And we have had a practice when we've been able to sit down and do, our reflections together. Sometimes that's, end of year reflections. Sometimes when we have a bit more time, it's sort of the weekly time to sit down and be able to talk them through. Personally, one of the ways in which it's been challenged, 2 years ago, my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And I mentioned one of the values is family. Like family first is a critical value for both of us. And I really needed to go back and spend a good amount of time. And over a period of 18 months, I spent somewhere around 8 months back in Edmonton, with only a very small fraction of it with Alana joining me, because I had to look after my dad and help with his health. It put our values to the test because we really did want to family first, make sure my father was supported, make sure that the help was there. And at the same time, we're running a business together and we don't want to just let that drop and let that fall and all the people that we have commitments to there. So it is one of the things about being married co-founders of a company. And by this point in time, Duncan had largely stepped back and that wasn't because of some huge breakdown between us. He became the partner setting up a new $200 million deep tech fund. And there was just sort of a natural, like, Duncan's still involved. He's still a senior advisor. He's still very much engaged, but he's just not a co-founder involved day to day. And so when this happened and I had to go and spend all of that time, I wasn't as engaged as a co-founder. I couldn't be as engaged as a husband because I was on the other side of the ocean. That was a bit of a challenging time, and staying aligned on values was critical there for us to get through that.
Yeah, that was a very challenging time. It was a bit of a double whammy. And I think that's where being partners and co-founders are kind of make things exponentially better when things are like moving forward and you can just make progress and you're aligned and things are going great. It doesn't leave a lot of contingencies when our things don't go well. And that period put us to the test because we didn't know how long. It wasn't a period of weeks. We knew it would be months. We didn't really know how long. We didn't know the outcome. There were so many unknowns on the personal side. Running a startup, there's not a lot of certainty with running a startup. So that's kind of what you sign up for. Like, okay, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty in my professional life for the foreseeable future. Mm-hmm. But pairing that with the personal side also being hit with uncertainty, that was not a period I would like to repeat. One of the challenges, I would say probably the biggest challenge I think having a co-founder partner is which hat are you wearing? And mm-hmm. They do not say the same thing. My COO hat would say, I need my CEO in the office for these meetings tomorrow. My wife hat would be like, you do what you need to do. Take care of yourself. The pieces did not align in that way. And those decisions were often at the expense of the other. And so to wear those two hats it goes right back to values, trusting that it's going to work out, making sure that the order of steps is in the right order, that mm-hmm. family first means the wife hat goes on first. And if that means the COO is asked to figure more out than she thought, then she does that. And so I think that there's some pieces there, but that ultimately on the other side of the most intense period of that time, it is stronger on kind of working through those challenges. And it also puts to test what is most important. And when you're a co-founder and a spouse, for me, a spouse always is more important.
I think Annie, to that question that you were sort of asking, how do we reflect on those values? I think particularly in that period, we didn't have the time to reflect on the values. They were embedded in every decision. I'm not sure we've had a steady practice over the last 4 or 5 years that has helped us keep always oriented around that, but it just comes up with every decision. It's in every decision you make, every strategy conversation you have, every conversation about family and how does that balance with what we're trying to do, and are we doing this family trip or are we going to this conference?
What's coming up for me is this question of how to provide support to the other person. Whether am I providing support as a co-founder or am I providing support as a spouse? And it's something that I talk about with co-founders who are exclusively co-founders as well, is what do you expect from your partner, your co-founding partner? How do you expect them to support you functionally, which is the typical conversation, but also how do you expect them to support you socially and emotionally? And that looks different for every co-founding pair. And it only becomes more nuanced when there's multiple hats that you're holding in that person's life, whether it's as a spouse or as a sibling, as a parent, as a close friend. And so the more hats that you're holding and the more overlap you have in your lives, the more challenging it becomes to understand how to provide support and when. But as you were saying, the benefits of that are that there's such deep trust and respect and empathy. And if there's values alignment and clarity on what our priorities are, you can get through that together and provide amazing support. It's not always easy. It's oftentimes more difficult. But in certain circumstances, that payoff can be absolutely worth it. And if that's how you like to, if you're kind of an all-in person and love to have the people that you love in all aspects of your life, it can be a really beautiful process.
Completely agree. And I think that that comes out with, Alana and I will put in 12 hours a day for 30 days in a row sometimes because that's just what it takes. And then we get a day off and it's like, so what are we going to do together? Do we want to go to a movie? And it's like, it doesn't even occur that we're not going to want to do something. And it's like, yes, we have friends. Yes, we have other people. And we need to see them and communicate with. Yeah. But the fact that that level of resonance is there, that's also been one of the things that just reinforces we've been on the right track.
Since your lives are so intertwined, have you thought about, and this is something I advise founders to do, is to talk about contingency planning? What happens if one of us wants to leave, whether it's in a personal respect or a professional respect? What happens if one of us wants a change or change is what's best for the company or for our relationship? Have you talked about those circumstances and how do you think about those conversations with each other?
It's a great question. We've had some conversations about it, but there's a lot of contingencies around how do we build out the organization so that, for example, when we decide to have kids and how are we going to do that? Or I decide, if I move on to do something else and Alana ends up just running the show herself or vice versa. I don't think we've had that conversation. What if one of us stays in and the other one gets out? Because that's
we have though.
Well, I guess,
Jason has always set as CEO. He's always said, I don't want to be CEO for more than the first several years. I've always had in my mind, well, Jason is CEO now. He's a founding CEO, but that's an entirely different skill set than when you reach steady state and then you need a CEO to run. And usually it's the board that fires the founding CEO and replaces them. Well, in this case, Jason will fire himself. Be like, I'm out. But that's also been the ethos. Whereas I see myself, I really love it when things are running steady. In the early years when they're not running steady, it's the more challenging time for me personally. It's harder for me to enjoy, I'll put it that way. So we've talked for years around how it might be a very good next step for Jason to step out of the role of CEO, but me to step into it.
It's rare to hear co-founders talk about that next transition, right? Like that's not something that typically gets discussed, or there's fear there of, oh, if my next step is outside this company, I don't want to offend my co-founder, my leadership team. And it sounds like you've not only navigated that in a nice way with Duncan as his life priorities changed and a co-founder role wasn't right for him, and you changed that working relationship. You're similarly having those future-oriented conversations here where, oh, maybe I'm more passionate about going back into another early stage company and building that up. Jason and Alana, you're saying, no, this is it for the long term, and let's figure out a way to make both of those realities happen for us and approach it as an us versus kind of these problems as opposed to us versus each other and our different priorities. And so I think that's a really important conversation to be having in founding teams. And the fact that your lives are so intertwined outside of work as well, I can imagine makes those conversations easier because your personal lives have so much impact on each other. So you want each other to be happy. And of course, you're also in a happy marriage and want the other person to be happy. And if that means different professional trajectories, that's okay and seems like a great and regular, it sounds like, conversation that you're having.
Yeah. I guess I've always thought about it. if I haven't made myself redundant in 5 to 6 years, then I really haven't been doing my job very well as a founding CEO. I guess that's always been my mental model for every job I have. Alana, your mental model of one life is as opposed to this concept of work-life balance, this idea of you have one life and what do you want to do with it, and what impact do you want to create, and what family do you want to have, and you can have it all, but probably not all at the same time. You have to be able to prioritize and strategize, and sometimes there'll be a lot more for one thing than for the other.
It was interesting because that one life philosophy, I was first introduced to that in early 2019. And so I really went into meeting Jason and meeting Duncan and co-founding. And then like, as things evolved beyond that, it was kind of a new philosophy that I was thinking a lot about. It's really easy for a work-life balance to just create a lot of tension with both, and it ends up just being kind of a fight between the two. And rather, I like to think of it as a pie chart, that everyone has a pie chart and you figure out how much. You only have one. You can't like make it bigger or suddenly have two pie charts, because that's not realistic. So how are you going to divvy up your 24 hours a day? And you get a pie chart, and it's each individual's choice. And so how I divvy up my time and Jason divvies up his time, it's important that there's alignment on that. But also, we each individually have to be okay with how we're spending our time and where we're spending it. And there are moments that we don't align on certain pieces or, certain times, but they're few and they're small, and it doesn't set us up for the friction of setting life and work against each other and thinking that it's an either or, where it's just a difference in the amount of time each one gets at different periods of the year and across the years.
What an amazing motto to be shared on, that one life. And it gets back to values and having a clear alignment. And I even think having a clear mantra or motto that is shared can really help to drive that and say we're working towards the same thing. It sounds like for the two of you, this is absolutely the right relationship to be in. You would really enjoy building this life together in all aspects. I guess the question is, do you think this is right for everyone?
Absolutely not for everybody. I have an uncle and aunt who lived together, worked together for the entirety of the 30 years that I knew them before they passed. And it worked brilliantly for them. And then I think of others in my family who have literally said to me, I never want to retire because I can't imagine spending all day at home with my wife. I'm like, y'all should not co-found something together.
I completely agree. It's not for everyone. It was for my parents. So I had role models stepping into this, really strong role models. They've been married for, I think it's almost 50 years now, something like that. I've lost count. And they ran a business together for 30 or 35 of them. So I had that as a role model, and yet there's kind of few and far between. I don't think it is right for everyone, because you also need to align on the trade-offs, that there are trade-offs, and as that pie chart, the amounts kind of change around. You have to be aligned on what those are, and when the personal life is going to take a little bit more of a backseat, and when the professional life, then that's going to take a little bit more of a backseat, and how you're going to positively negotiate how things are working out. So I think it is more unique than not, and yet when it works, it can be a really awesome thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'm hearing is there can be a lot of really great couples, and there's a lot of really great co-founders, and finding that overlap of great couples who make great co-founders, that's much more rare and requires a lot of conversation to see if you're in a relationship or a partnership that can kind of do both and should do both.
Yeah.
And that there's a lot of benefits to that, but there's also a lot of trade-offs. Before we close out, I always like to ask, what is your one tidbit of advice for founding teams like yours?
Talk about values. Make that a foundational part of your first conversations early on.
And don't hold back. Be 100% honest when you're talking about them. Because otherwise it's going to come back and bite. be like, well, I said this, but actually all my actions are moving in this direction. So having that conversation and having it set up so that everyone is comfortable to be honest and transparent about where they're at. And there's that respect for when they align, awesome. And when they are opposing, that's okay. Like, and having that space and that conversation.
Thank you again for sharing about your partnership and how to change the world. And we'll drop your contact info in the description. But I wanted to just say thank you for sharing your perspectives.
Thank you
Real
so much.
pleasure, Annie. Thank you so much for having us.
Hey, thanks for listening to the show this week. Please make sure to click the follow button on your podcast app so you never miss an episode of the show. I'm Annie Garofalo, and thank you for listening to How I Met My Co-Founder.